Clear to engage. Time on target. 5 mics. Out.
That's the mistake of the year right there, letting me lead us off.
Oh, you're good at it, Reagan.
Well, it's because we have good guests, really.
Because you got your Kirkland hat on, you're ready to go. You went to Walmart and got a free hat with some purchase.
Excuse me, Kirkland is Costco.
Costco.
That's the Costco brand.
Not Sam's Club.
Not Sam's Club, also different. Although Sam's Club has cool stuff, I've heard. We don't have them in Oregon as far as I know. Listen, this is my thing I buy a ton of Kirkland stuff because what Costco does is they have name brand stuff, and then the stuff that sells really well, their rule is basically they have to make that same product or something very similar, but they have to do it at least 1% better in a certain metric, and then they usually sell it for slightly cheaper. And then, sometimes they'll have both of the competing brand and theirs sell well enough they'll both be there. And sometimes the Kirkland brand absolutely murders the name brand. And then they have that's basically how they develop all of their products. So a lot of their stuff is also made by, shockingly, the same companies that make the name brand stuff. They just slap different labels on it.
I think we went to the Costco in California because they sell, we just went in there, but they sell booze in there, right? In Nevada and places like that. And they have like the Kirkland whiskey and Kirkland vodka. And you get, clearly the vodka's Grey Goose.
I was trying to think of if there was something similar to politics to relate it in so then we could go into topics, but hard pivot. It's not working out today. I don't have enough. I told my wife I needed to make more coffee and she's like, drink water. I'm not about that. We have John Horvick back. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much.
We have some stuff to talk about. Brian, you've been doing the research, and by research, scrolling through John Horvick's Twitter feed, which, if I remember right, is at Horvick. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes. And so always make sure you follow. You can even turn on alerts, honestly, because almost every time you don't tweet, I would say you don't tweet a lot. It looks like every couple of days you tweet, but it's always very poignant and always contains some data point. And I think that that's super useful for people. So they should follow.
I like a chart and graph. So particularly when I get my hands on some new data. But I go quiet for a little bit when the data is quiet. Because the world is divided now in the social media platforms. I am over at the Blue Sky too for your more liberally inclined listeners. If the content's the same, but the audiences have split a bit. So
and that's honestly, I don't like it as much because it's made it way less fun to follow, because it used to be, Brian, that every legislative account, Dem and Republican, posted on Twitter, and so you'd see like just big old Twitter fights explode, and those are so rare now. And I wish we weren't in that kind of a scenario anymore.
I try to pick them, but nobody just is willing to engage.
Yeah.
I throw some salacious stuff out there. So usually it's directed at TriMet. Has been my pick of choice, and then occasionally I'll get like some media people. What was it? I think it was Julius Shumway one day goes, "What's your beef with TriMet?"
That's funny.
And I said, besides the fact that it's a waste of money, and nobody rides it, nobody cares, and it goes nowhere, and it has no use in America today. No, I'm good. Yeah.
It's a very nuisance to take.
I do ride it. Our householders are TriMet users, so it's not zero. But I
knew there was a few out there.
Ridership isn't what it was pre-pandemic for sure.
You're one of the 3%, John.
And I think a lot of people, because I always say how the poor and people that need to get to work, you use it by choice, I'm sure. So because the problem that a lot of people have is like the point A to point B reference, right? So if you're in Portland, there's either a bus or a TriMet or something, that gets you, I would say, relatively close to wherever you're trying to get to. But as soon as you get out of there, it's very difficult. Like they always say, oh, the coast needs public transportation. And I'm like, no, they don't, because not everybody lives on 101. And how are you going to walk 4 blocks with their groceries, from where the bus drops you off? And it's just not a reality in Western America, it's not a big of a reality because there's so much land and so much space between everybody. And then it's definitely not a reality outside of major metros. So that's usually where my beef ends. Oh, I digress.
Let's start with. Oh, I've just made my.
Even John didn't
up.
fall for it. I was waiting for John to start getting into a trimate fight with the podcast, and he's not going to go there.
Let's start with Merkley. So you tweeted some So this is you guys. This is DHM research, and you use Data Wrapper to make it look very pretty. Impressions of Jeff Merkley. So tell us about that. What's the data on Merkley? Because it seems like he had said to Willamette Week or to the Oregon Journalism Project it was a difficult decision deciding whether or not to run again. He took a long time relative to when an incumbent might announce their reelection plans. What do the data sort of tell you, and are there any conclusions you can draw from that?
Well, so our numbers have them at 48. So just positive or negative impressions. So this isn't about, necessarily doing a good job or you support a particular policy or whether you plan to vote for reelection or not. But just, do you feel good or bad about them? 48% say that they have a positive impression and 27% a negative impression. 25% say that they don't have one. They're unsure. They don't know. Electorally, these numbers aren't particularly surprising. I mean, certainly the incumbent Democratic senator in Oregon is going to be the overwhelming favorite. It was interesting from a just sort of, for us, for the three of us here who are very engaged in politics, a reminder that, 1 out of 4 Oregonians said that, they didn't know. He's running for his 4th term in the United States Senate and served in the Oregon legislature before that. The guy's not exactly a fresh face to Oregon voters, but people don't. It's a reminder that a lot of folks just aren't paying very close attention to politics. But his numbers are suggest that he's not any real threat to. I mean, these are not. Don't tell you everything, but there's nothing in here that says that you would think he's a threat to lose that.
You would need a lot of money to make that case. You could certainly change those numbers with a big campaign, right? But you need a lot of money, and who's going to invest it? I don't see.
You might be able to drive down the numbers for sure as favorables. I mean, ultimately, though, it's going to be a choice between a Democrat or a Republican candidate. Make a big difference who that. You could drive down as negatives, but then people would still have to choose to vote for Republican. And we are in the state that we are, in the times that we are, and I think that's fairly unlikely.
I looked at these numbers and I said, if somebody runs against Jeff Merkley, they're just stupid. And there's no way you got 30% of Republicans have a somewhat or very positive look on Merkley and only a 25% negative. Like, there's no way you're beating him, and nobody's going to give you any money to run against this guy. So there's just absolutely no way you win a race against Merkley. Even if you had $30 million, I don't think you could do it. So
a Republican's not going to be able to. I mean, you guys are closer to campaigns than I am, but I don't think a Republican can raise $30 million to run against Jeff Merkley here in Oregon. Now, I will say that this survey we asked about Jeff Merkley, and we didn't say Democratic Senator Jeff Merkley. And with 25% of people said that they don't know, and if we would have said Democrat besides the name, I bet those numbers for Republicans would have dropped some. But we would have activated some of those partisan sort of ideas. But, Jeff Merkley, the fact that he's not particularly well known is probably a reason that his negatives aren't quite as high as maybe they could be otherwise. But, got to give credit to him and, of course, Senator Wyden and Senator Smith before them. Our Oregon senators have spent a lot of time traveling the state, being in every county, being in a small town, shaking hands. And I think over time that does pay off.
Does seem like
they have Wyden's. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Brian.
I was just going to say, it seems like he's right that our senators seem to do more, travel more. There's always been a weird, every single county, every single year kind of mentality I don't know when that started, probably a long time ago, I would imagine, with the senators that get out. I mean, they get out way more than the governor does, and I bet her numbers are worse than these numbers.
Yeah, they're a little bit lower than these numbers. They are. Her negatives are higher for sure. We have noticed, if you get Wyden, you were going to ask about Wyden. I don't have new numbers for Wyden, so I can't speculate. The days where Wyden wins by enormous numbers in re-election are over, and I suppose to some degree Merkley's would be too, just because the politics have changed. You're not going to see, folks are much more partisan now than they were in the past. There's less swing voting than there was in the past. And so the opportunities to run up the numbers really, really big or lower. I mean, the margin, I believe when Wyden ran last time, I think it was the smallest margin. It was close to it if it wasn't the smallest, against Joey Perkins.
Joey Perkins, yeah.
Who is not the strongest candidate that has run statewide Republican office, but it does speak to, put an R or D by a name, how much impact.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like nobody breaks the 60 barrier anymore in Oregon.
It's going to be really hard. I mean, the days of, say, like John Kitzhaber's victory against Bill Sizemore, what was that, 98 or something like that, where he won 35 out of 36 counties. That's not the political reality anymore.
It is over.
Yeah. I think it flipped. I mean, I'm clicking back through each of Wyden's elections and his opponents and what they got to. I mean, 96 was when Wyden beat Gordon Smith 47-46. And then Wyden beat John Lim 60-33, 63-31 against Al King. And then in 2010, 57-39 against, remember this one, Jim Huffman, not John, Jim Huffman.
That would have been the Tea Party year.
Yep. And then he's been at 56 or 57 until this last one, 55%. But Mark Callahan, 6 years before that, got 33%. So sometimes they won't vote and sometimes they will vote for the more kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, fringe Republican candidate or unknown Republican candidate, and then he gets to run again if he wants, I guess, in 2028. Woof, that's a long time away.
We setting aside that's the polling numbers that I'm sure you guys have probably talked about some other podcasts, or just amongst yourselves, with the incumbents, statewide incumbents choosing to run for re-election, Governor Kotek and Senator Merkley. It's just this dam that builds up behind that. You could have imagined all sorts of crazy politics happening in Oregon this next cycle if one or both of them decided not to run for re-election.
Yeah, we talked about that on the last episode.
Because it holds up Republicans, serious Republicans wanting to run for state office. Of course, it holds up a whole bunch of younger Democrats who might want to do the same. So it puts things on ice for at least another 4 years and maybe longer. Wyden plans to run again in 6 years or so, or 4 years, I guess it is now. But assuming that that's the case, so you have that sort of dam that's going to build up behind that for a while.
What the other one that I've kind of put in here, since we're talking about Republicans, Democrats, I put in there the July 2025 index of consumer sentiment by party.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And looks like, kind of like what we saw there. And I also put in, percentage of Oregonians say the state is headed in the right direction or wrong direction, right? And so they're I think similar graphs, I guess, on some.
There's some. Well, let's talk about the consumer sentiment stuff. That's national data. That comes from the University of Michigan. They've been running a survey twice a month for, I don't know, 40, 50 years, a long time. And in the whole history, they don't have partisan breakdowns, but in the more recent history that they do. And if you pull up the chart that I have, you can find others that are out there too. But what you really see is when administrations shift from one party to another, you see their partisan voters just follow along and just turn on a dime. And so when Donald Trump was president the first go around, Republicans felt really positive about the economy and Democrats thought it was just the worst thing ever. And then on basically January 20th, the presidential term starts or ends, things flip immediately. And you see that again. The thing that is it is, you can maybe start to see in the data from the University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index is that it looks like sentiment has bottomed out, at least for the time being. So Democrats fell like off a cliff when Trump came into office, and you can see it bouncing back just a little bit. You see it certainly with independents. You see Republicans continue to rise. Underneath the data, the consumer sentiment index is made up of different questions, different scales. Sort of, if you look at how Republicans and Democrats feel on the kind of future expectations, how the economy is going to be tomorrow or into the future. And then they also ask questions about how people feel about the economy today. Asking questions about how the economic conditions of today, there's a difference between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats less positive than Republicans are, but it's relatively narrow compared to future expectations. And so what Democrats are really saying is that, now that a Republican's office, Donald Trump is in office, I think that things in the future are just going to fall apart, and Republicans are much more optimistic. But if you ask them how things are today, it's a little bit more narrow. We do so that's national data. If you look at DHM's data about Oregonians, we are seeing a slight uplift in how people are feeling about Oregon's economic conditions. Now, I do think that this is just my take. I think that runs a little bit counter. I could be wrong. I'm not an economist, but a little bit counter to some of the economic data that we're seeing. Unemployment numbers are bubbling up a little bit in Oregon. You see some pretty big layoffs at some of our most largest employers. Some worrying signs there. But at the same time, unemployment is still relatively low. The stock market's doing well. And what we're seeing is that Democrats in Oregon haven't turned too much against Oregon's economy. And we're seeing just a little bit of improvement among Republicans. The same thing is true with that right direction, wrong track question, where Democrats are certainly much more positive about the direction of the state than Republicans. But since the election, we've seen Democrats come down a little bit and Republicans come up a little bit. I don't think the Republicans, I know Republicans aren't particularly jazzed about the direction of the state, but so long as a Republican is president, we sort of see those sentiments filter down to statewide expectations as well. So actually the gap between Democrats and Republicans is relatively small right now compared to the last, say, 20 years.
Yeah, well, I mean, Republicans 20% say we're heading in the right direction.
But it was about 8 or 9% a couple years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it was really bottom and down.
Well, and that's tracked with, I think Governor Kotek still has the worst approval rating in the country among all governors compared, and that's like a quarterly, but the difference between her negative and her positive impression has basically now gone from, I think she was in the -7 to 10 range, and now she's in almost even range.
Yeah, so Morning Consult, which is a big research shop that does all sorts of research, including political research. Every quarter, they put out new numbers on the popularity of all 50 state governors. I think Kotek has moved off the bottom, but she's certainly in the bottom tier. I think the Iowa governor might be the lowest right now. I'm not exactly sure. I don't follow Iowa politics closely, so I'm not exactly sure what's happening there. But and Morning Consult numbers are always more positive than every other. I like their stuff because their governor's ratings and their Senate ratings, because you can see, however they're doing their measurement, you can see that consistently measured across all 50 states. But if you look at like DHM's numbers versus Morning Consult's, or CNN's numbers versus Morning Consult is always more positive than everyone else. So I would say, like, when you look at those numbers, Reagan, about the plus minus about Governor Kotek, keep in mind that there's, across every governor that they measure, there's more, for whatever reason, more positive sentiment in their work than just about anything else's.
I do think, though, you look at the map, it's all green except for Iowa. You're right. So Kotek is a little bit off the bottom now. Most governors, Bob Ferguson in Washington has a plus 23. Let's go for Jim Pillen in Nebraska is plus 11. J.B. Pritzker in Illinois is plus 19. DeSantis plus 16. I think this does, though, tell you something, which is one, that the governor's races, while influenced by national politics, are still slightly different.
Yeah,
they're still
Vermont. Phil Scott in Vermont, I think, is at the the list, right? He's a Democrat. He's a Republican in Vermont. You look at John Bashir in Kentucky, a Democrat in red Kentucky. The Democratic governor in Kansas, I think, is doing fine. So there can be some separation between national politics and state and local politics. Now, there's the correlation exists. It's just not one.
Yeah. I mean, Lombardo is a swing state governor's Republican. He's plus 21, right? So I do think that in some ways, even though Morning Consult's numbers are more rosy, I think they in some ways are more accurate in terms of the general mood, which is most people, unless your governor is really like going hard in the paint on some sort of large like scandal or issue, generally you get positive marks for just not screwing stuff up, is kind of what it seems like. Whereas people just have this general impression that the federal government is always screwed up, and so they're congressional, they like their own congressmen, but they hate Congress and they hate the president for the most part.
Was her dumping of her numbers so bad that the hangover is still existing with Kotek, or have we always kind of have our governors? I mean, Kitzhaber always had pretty high marks. I'm trying to think of when the last time was it.
Right. So it's a good question, one that I wish I had a better answer for. And maybe that someone out there has long-term trends of all 50 governors sort of tracked together over time. And I'm just not aware of that data. What I'm aware is the more recent numbers, and Brown was, consistently when Morning Consult was measuring her against the other 50 or 49 governors, she was at the bottom or kind of bouncing at the bottom. I do think that there's some momentum, some carryover from Governor Brown to Governor Kotek.
I feel that way.
I think some of that's based upon personality. Some of it is based upon probably gender. Some of it is based upon a lot of it's going to be based upon the conditions. People are still mad about the same things that they were mad about 2 years ago. They're still upset about homelessness and cost of living and housing affordability and public safety. Those issues haven't changed. And so just like, you can't just say like, well, rationally, if people were unhappy 2 years ago, their day-to-day lives, they're still frustrated by the same things.
Yeah, because then COVID obviously has, because I even saw that in some of the numbers when I was looking at them. It was interesting to look at, how the index consumer sentiment, like where through COVID, Democrats just kept going up and everybody else was going down because of COVID. But Democrats, their outlook they were fine because we had a Democrat in the White House, basically, because their forward-looking mentality was higher, regardless of COVID, when everything else said it was horrible, that the country was going to, go into the tank. Democrats are like, we're good. Let's go get your shot and make it happen. So I just find that interesting that they didn't really even have a dip. I mean, there's just a small blip there, but that I'm assuming was kind of right when COVID kind of came out, maybe, but for the most part, until after Trump came back in, and then it was just like kaboom, bottom drop.
I'm rooting for a strong, robust economy now and forever. But Brian, I promise you, if things turn sour over the course of the next 3 years, Republican numbers will hold up.
Yeah. Oh, you think?
I think recent history, the relatively recent history would say that there is a lot of partisan cheerleading when it comes to economic sentiment, which does beg the question: what's the value of those questions? What's the value of that public opinion research?
Good question.
The question. So when we ask Oregonians just to rate their personal financial situation, about 60% of Oregonians say that they're in good shape. That's not like the awesome, but another way to say is most Oregonians think that they are doing okay. Oregonians rate their personal financial situation better than they do the state's. And we also see smaller partisan differences when we ask people about how they're doing personally than having to rate state or national economic conditions. I think that is proving to be a better metric of how people are actually doing, that comes closer to also mirroring what their behavior is. I mean, people can say the economy is terrible, but we haven't seen big slowdowns in spending, for example.
No, if you're out there in the economy, I don't think I've seen much change in anything. Even real estate, I've looked at it. I mean, I know there's slowdowns and there's pockets and all that sort of stuff, but the reality is if there's only so much inventory on the market. And so if you have a good home, there's enough people willing to buy it. They're still out there, even with 6.5% interest rates and all the things. I just don't think we're going to see a slowdown. I just think there's too much money in the system. I think that, and there's too much borrowing capacity in the system that allows people to continue spending. I don't know, as long as they have a job, because we're not seeing unemployment rates spike. We're not seeing, all the Intel layoffs, every single one of those people will be picked up by another, chip maker, technology company, regardless of what they do. Like, they're going to easily be picked up. Now they may have to move out of Hillsboro, or wherever they're living, but I don't see anybody, like, if you want a job, there's a job out there, and they're well-paying jobs.
We can get better guests to talk about Oregon's economy and the job market. Certainly, folks, I imagine, elected leaders in Washington County are anxious about it. But most people don't work for Intel.
Yeah, I know. If somebody's telling me, "Oh my gosh, that's going to just tank the state budget," and I'm like, "You realize that's 3,000 jobs, and there's 1.2 million, 1.4 million, something like that." W-2 employees in the state of Oregon. So the reality is that's a very small number. I'm sure they're high paying jobs and all the things, but it's not. I remember we had an economist on, and I think he was talking about that, the idea that even if Intel goes away, you're really not one company can't destroy the economy. Now there's a cumulative effect, right? So, but we haven't seen that because that would show up in the unemployment data.
One thing we have, just as we're talking about the economy, one thing, big change we have, I don't have the numbers in front of me, someone talks sort of round numbers, but they'll tell the story. During the pandemic, when folks talked about the Great Resignation, remember the Great Resignation? I mean, I think it was always sort of I will say at the time, I thought it was a silly sort of thing that was worry that people had, but I think it certainly has proved to be the case now. But there was something real about how people felt about workers' employer relationships. So we've been tracking since the pandemic a question, this isn't the exact wording, but something close to who has more power in Oregon's workplace now, or language to that effect. Is it employers or employees? Well, it was about a 40 percentage point gap in favor of employees during the pandemic. Excuse me. It was about a 5 or 10 percentage point gap, but now it's about a 40% gap in favor of employers. There's just been this sort of, real change in sentiment where during the pandemic, employees really felt that they were empowered, and that, they could switch jobs, they could ask for a raise, they could put pressure on their employers about where they work. But now it's really changed where, it's about, for about 40 percentage point gap where people say that employers have more power than employees.
Wow. Huh.
And because we only started measuring that during the pandemic when it was an especially strange time, it's quite possible that that is the really weird outlier where Oregonians will tell us that employees have more power. And we're going to look back at that and say, man, must have been a really, really weird job market. Which is probably my guess is what will be. But that's our starting point. That's what we got to start with. And certainly things have changed a lot since then.
I bet if you overlaid that number with the sentiment, like positive or negative about unions, you could see some, of those changes where, when unions were able to win big concessions generally and like the structures of the laws, that people would feel like they're more empowered at different points. And then it kind of settles back into, generally, and if you're an at-will employment situation, your employer has a lot more power than you do. And even in a union situation, generally, I think most people would think their employer has, more power. But I think that's just how it's always going to be, right? Because there's the entity that's in charge of telling the people what to do. I think it's just kind of a structural thing.
Right. I'd never expect it to be, well, I should say never, because there was a time in Oregon where employees thought that power than employees. But I think in a general sense, I wouldn't expect to
rare
unless we have some, remarkable event again, like not like COVID, but something just sort of out of the ordinary. But whether it remains at 40 or gets to 20 or gets to 15 or gets to 60, those things will be important.
So I know it would be silly to try to like predict the midterms right now. So I'm not going to ask you to do that. But what I do want to ask you to do is maybe talk us through your thought process. What kind of numbers are you looking at, or what kind of data would you be looking for to start informing how you understand what Oregonians or what the U.S. as a whole is going to do in the midterms? I just saw. Let's see if I can find it, but I just saw some polling comparing where we are now versus where we are at this time in the 2018 cycle, right? So in mid 2017, where was the polling numbers at? And Dems were ahead by about 9 points at that point, and now today they're ahead by like 3 in one of the generic ballot surveys, right? So you could look at that, you blow that way out of proportion. Oh, Republicans are in way better shape, even with Democrats being ahead. Again, I'm not necessarily saying that that's true. Could be true. What are the indicators and the data points and the stuff that you're looking at to start seeing if anyone is making, or what kind of decisions might get made in that election?
I'm going to look at the same indicators that I think political scientists and sort of political commentators, political sort of insiders looked at for all time, which is that, generic ballot. I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look at the favorability of President Trump. We'll look at the favorability of the two parties. Certainly, we'll look at the number of swing districts out there, and who is up or down in those. I'll look at some of the things that people have been paying a little bit more attention to, at least in sort of the discourse, which is those sort of off-cycle special elections when a candidate dies or has to leave office or something like that. Mm-hmm. I'll look at all those things. I'll look at the economic situations. All those are going to be, I think, the right metrics to look at, continue to look at. What I think is challenging is that comparing 2026 to 2018, or comparing sort of how the out party does in midterm elections historically. I think that if those relations could somehow be both weaker and stronger, I'm not sure how I want to express it, but because people are so much more partisan now, less likely to be swing voters now than sort of the long-term trends, that things like generic ballot, Democrats might do just fine relative to the political realities of 2026, or Republicans might do fine relative to political realities of 2026. But those predictors about, say, right direction, wrong track, or generic ballot, or how approval of the president might not be as strong now as in the past, just because if you're a D, you vote for a D, and if you're R, you vote for R, and there's not much in between. I'm sure we've talked about this in the past, and I'm sure other guests have as well. But turnout just matters a lot, and the coalitions between the two parties, where certainly when I was becoming politically aware and sort of getting into the industry, it was just common wisdom, whether it was correct or not. I think it's sort of correct, but not. It was overplayed, because they're common wisdom. The Republicans are going to do well in off or midterm elections and special elections, because their electorate was older, and older people turn out to vote, and higher income and higher income people turn out to vote. Well, the Democratic coalition and the Republican coalitions have shifted in important ways that affects turnout. Mm-hmm. Democrats have really locked in those educated, college educated, higher income, very consistent voters. They just have those locked in. And Republicans have, there's a smaller cohort of the overall, a smaller portion of the overall electorate, and Republicans have done well with lower education, lower class voters who are a bigger chunk of the electorate, but their turnout is lower.
And inconsistent.
Which gives Democrats a relative edge in, I think, midterm elections, but certainly the special elections that we're seeing happen.
So you don't see the George Bush 2002. Do you think that was just relative to 9/11?
Yes, I think the 2002 was relative to 9/11. I mean, who knows what events are going to happen between now and 2026? I certainly wouldn't know how to predict a terrorist attack, but I think that played a lot into it. I would be very surprised if we sort of see the 2010 shellacking that Obama experienced with the Republican wave in 2010. I just don't think, well, of course, the future can surprise us, but I just don't think the dynamics are set up for big swings like we've seen in the past.
We have the talk of all the gerrymandering, right? That was going around last week where Democrats were like, oh, well, we're going to gerrymander these states to pick up seats because Republicans have gerrymandered. And the Republicans were like, well, now hold on. We have states that we can gerrymander too. And I kind of think actually both sides will do nothing because it's sort of a mutually assured destruction sort of a situation where both of them have enough wiggle room. They can probably do, even if they did it, it probably breaks out to be exactly what we're at now. And you also run the risk of overextending your electorate. So if there's a 2 or 3 point shift, instead of having 5 seats, you've got 10 or 15 that all flip, right? And then you do see one of those big waves. And that's what's eliminated the ability for a wave, is because a lot of these states now have been under one party control for a long time. And so they've made adjustments to for the states where people don't move as much. You see Florida being kind of fluid. You see Texas being kind of fluid. You see, conversely, New York and Illinois being kind of fluid because people are leaving some of those states. They get a little swingier because you can't predict exactly how people are going to move. But for the states that are a little bit more stable, they've sort of eliminated a lot of the contested. They've narrowed the amount of contested seats that are available, and to a couple of ones that are just really swingy all the time, right? And the rest are kind of all they're not even on the board. No one's even looking to put them on the board. They threw those pieces away a long time ago as something that they'd even put up on their map. And so, I think if both sides did overextend and there was the opportunity for one side to do really well or not, you might see much bigger changes to the law. That comes out of that if you can get it timed where you have your swing with your new president. But otherwise, it's going to be a lot more of the same, which is Congress is going to be very closely divided, regardless of which party is in control, both in the Senate and in the House.
We're talking on July 28th, and I will admit that I lost track the last 5 or 6 days of what was going on in Texas. So I'm not sure if they succeeded in doing this or they put it to the side or sort of where that stands. If it
was all bluster through press releases and stuff like that, where they were all threatening to gerrymander their own states, and they're all gonna call special sessions to go gerrymander and screw the party that was not in control of their legislatures and all that. So I didn't understand why it was happening in the middle of summer either. People got bored, is what happened. They're like, we're done with session. We're bored. What can we do? And they don't have like a transportation special session to call, so they're just grasping at straws out here, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I saw Gavin Newsom was weighing in on it like almost every 2 or 3 hours on X. And I'm just like, why are you weighing in on this?
Oh, I don't know. I'm not Gavin Newsom, but he's an ambitious politician who knows he's getting better at getting media attention. And I imagine that has a lot to do with it. It rallies partisan Democrats around them. And
I'm going to pivot a little bit. I'm going to pivot a little bit off of this to Reagan's point with the presidential stuff, because then I want to kind of pivot into your recent survey. You talking about what Oregonians care about, because I think we're in an opportunity where maybe we could pick up seats in the midterm. It tends to depend on what's going on in the world, right? Like what the issue sets are, I think, and do those issue sets set up for Republicans or do they set up for Democrats, et cetera? But I've never seen homelessness with such a high percentage of the most important problem. And I don't know, and maybe you can lean into how you've done things, but I wonder how that is relative.
Sure.
Have you ever seen a 43%? And I think housing affordability being second. Right. I mean, you're 59%, basically 60% of the people in Oregon, because there's a few other points in there for other things, cost of living and stuff that is probably just same thing.
Right.
I mean, we're talking like 70% of the electorate cares nothing more than homelessness and housing affordability, basically. Right.
So you're asking about a question that we ask regularly in our surveys and have for a long time. And so the wording sometimes has shifted a little bit over the years, but it's essentially this, and it's been very consistent now for a while. But what is the most important problem facing Oregon today? It's an open-ended question. People can say anything they want. It's the same language that Gallup uses in their monthly surveys, very similar language to what other pollsters use. If I go back in DHM's archives and look at all the times we've asked this question or the equivalent question, there are a few things that really stand out. One is that for most of sort of the last 25 years, the top two issues have been either jobs in the economy and K-12 education. And it's basically they flip-flopped. When the economy was doing well, people would say education. When the economy was doing poorly, people would say the economy is the most important problem. There's a couple outliers in there if you look across the years, but it is more or less that's what it is.
Yep.
And then you get to the late teens and you start to see homelessness show up. So, previous to the late teens, homelessness just wasn't, 0%, 1% just wasn't even showing up at all. So it wasn't like it was the third tier and just not cracking the top, just wasn't even showing up at all. And in that sort of period from say the late 1990s to the teens, like when people were saying jobs in the economy and we were saying K-12 education, we do these surveys a lot. So there's some sort of peaks and valleys, but basically about 20-25% would be the highest percentage that the number one issue would get. So even during the Great Recession, like jobs in the economy was getting about 25% of the comments of people saying that was the most important problem. Even during the peak of the Great Recession, it's getting to about 25%. I say that so like homelessness is new, but also homelessness in the 40s is remarkable over the last 25 years as an issue that has that intensity, that salience with the community. Now, it is, I suppose any of these issues are complicated, but it is complicated by the fact that people are saying different things when they say homelessness. If you do a lot of focus groups, you realize when people are saying homelessness, they're expressing different things. Some people are talking about, feeling compassionate for those who don't have shelter. Some people are talking about chaos and drug use and mental illness and all sorts of things in between. And they certainly, don't have agreement about what the proper solutions are, whether it's law enforcement or housing first or shelters or daytime shelters or nighttime shelters, kind of the arguments that happen in Portland right now. The other thing that's really important to know about this is that in order to get 41% or 43%, whatever, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in our last survey about that, Oregonians to say that means it has to be a top issue in every part of the state. It is not just Portland. It is not just the Portland metro area. We get these sorts of high numbers in statewide surveys, but also when we're doing surveys in local communities on the coast in Southern Oregon and Eastern Oregon. These are things that are problems sort of across the state. Brian, to your point, I think one of the challenges for Republicans, I think it frustrates Republicans. And see if we regularly ask, or we did just a couple months ago ask Oregonians, not open. We asked open-ended. We also asked a series of close-ended questions. How much of a concern is this problem for you? Very concerned, somewhat concerned, not too concerned, not at all concerned. But then also, which party do you trust more on that issue? Oregonians tend to trust Democrats more on homelessness than they trust Republicans. You might, if you're a Republican-oriented person, or you don't live in the Portland metro area, you might find that very confounding. But that's remains to be the case. That Oregonians, on the whole, still tend to trust Democrats more on homelessness than they do Republicans, even though we've had intense problems in Democratic-leaning areas.
But that would be why Oregonians trust Republicans with the economy a little bit more, why they trust law enforcement, right? Yeah. Law and order, they trust Republicans a little bit more. Climate change, they trust Democrats a little bit more, probably a lot more. Somehow we're polluters as filthy Republicans, but maybe it's just because that's what they talk about. And it seems like Republicans love to talk about, bring the legislature up, right? We did not really have any discussion on homelessness. Reagan, can you think of there was no robust discussion on bills regarding homelessness the entire session?
We had in house housing, we did have the major package of funding to maintain the current homeless shelter and start building the system by which OHCS is supposed to manage that infrastructure. However, there were a lot of bills on both sides of the equation, either sort of reducing the amount of rights people had to hang out in public spaces in their tents, be homeless. And then on the other side, more the Republican side, giving clarity to what is legally allowed and clearly defining what a homeless camp is so that cities and counties could essentially disrupt and eliminate homeless camps that didn't meet the law. Neither chamber's housing committees had that debate, which is still, I think, the core debate. Because if you have some on the left saying there's a right to rest anywhere, everywhere, all the time, or some version of that with very few limits, and then you have the more Republican version, which is either the right to rest doesn't exist, which there are some of those, or it's only when the city defines a camp and where it is, everywhere else is not legal. And we haven't had that debate here in a substantial way. And I think that is part of what is preventing the next step on whatever the homelessness is, right? They stood up a bunch of infrastructure, mostly during COVID, mostly with federal funding. They are trying to maintain that infrastructure with much less federal funding now and more general fund dollars. There's not really a plan to move on from that beyond doing the things that would eliminate the homelessness. It's much more of the debate has shifted to be significantly more about drugs and mental health and significantly more about housing and production and not on the what you see in front of you homelessness.
So in this survey, just talk about a few other things just to put kind of the overall picture into context. So on this you think of a 2x2 sort of table, importance and trust. So what is relatively high importance and where Republicans are trusted? And that's of the things we asked about 15 or so, didn't ask everything, but the things that were relatively high importance and Republicans were more trusted than Democrats. It's managing the state budget, addressing crime, and government spending. The issues that are pretty evenly split between Democrats and Republicans, so moderate sort of importance and pretty evenly divided on trust in Democrats and Republicans. That's immigration, gun policy, taxes, and election security. What is a relatively lower trust lower importance and might surprise folks given how much they are talked about, how much politics surrounds them, how much money is raised around them, but relatively low importance: environment, climate change, abortion, DEI, transgender issues. By far, the least important was transgender issues. But even though they're relatively low importance to voters, or they say they're low importance, Democrats overwhelmingly win on the question of trust. And Democrats were going to win in Oregon, certainly the presidential election last go around, but Oregon didn't shift like much of the country did. And there's lots of reasons for that. Some of them have to do with race. We could talk about that. But I do think that the extent that, say, transgender issues were elevated in the presidential election, I have no doubt that was effective for President Trump in his reelection and winning some of those swing states. It's an issue that, to the extent that Oregonians are really engaged in it, I'm talking the electorate overall that they're engaged in it, the more it's talked about, the more they think that Democrats are the better party on it. And so Republicans do get harmed on some of those issues in ways that maybe play well nationally. And you might say, well, then why do Democrats talk about, say, climate change so much if voters say it's not that important? It's because if an election is about climate change, voters trust Democrats more on it than they do Republicans, and so it behooves them to talk. Same with abortion. I mean, these are important issues. I don't want to say that they're not important. People care about them, but just if you should identify what's important or what's the most important issue to them, it's not abortion, it's not climate change, it's not DEI, but these are things that one party does better than the other. And
you should every month survey the legislators on what's the most important issues.
Oh, I would love to do it.
With
I would
all
love
90 legislators and then
I'd love to put it side by side. I think that would be like, I mean, I genuinely think that would be good. Like, I'm a pollster, so what I do is like, so like, I have that wearing that hat, but I think it'd be really instructive to them and to the public to not to shame anybody, but for just folks to be aware of where the differences are and where the similarities are. And I think that would be instructive and helpful. It's not going to happen. They're not going to take my surveys for that purpose, I don't think, but I would like it.
I would like it. I think it'd be great. I would, because I think you're right. I think that the idea, one, politicians like to speak to what they're also, they just inherently like to speak to their base more than they like to speak to the other side's base. So therefore, they're always going to like hit those things that they care about. They think their voters care about more, their base voters, and not just the generic voters. But to see the circle back to that homelessness thing, that's what really, I mean, to see it hit at such a high number. And I think it's like you said, there's a algorithm of things probably pulled into there now because it's just such a wide topic. But so is the economy. Jobs in the economy is a wide bucket too, right? So
sure, and it would be true with the economy too. But my point is sort of just to emphasize it is that if Democrats are in power and have been at this time where voters are so frustrated about homelessness and it's been an issue for a long time now, it's intense. Why do voters continue to vote for Democrats? Well, one, they care about other issues too. They actually trust Democrats more on homelessness than they do Republicans. And Republican solutions might not be whatever Republican solution is. Might not be the solution that Oregonians say that they're looking for.
I think you're spot on, and I think we have to come up with some sort of compassionate conservatism. I mean, Bush came out with kind of some of that stuff, right? That wins over that trust. And we don't have to win over a lot. We just have to pull, 5 to 8% of those voters that trust us a little bit with a homeless solution. And I think it's coming up with a solution because Democrats don't have one either. It's just more money. And that trust, I think, is equated in the fact they know the Democrats will spend money on it. And
one of just sorry to interrupt, Brian, but just one of the world's more complicated in this poll question, and I say that up front. But when we ask Oregonians, is homelessness mostly caused by mental illness and drug addiction, or is it mostly caused by a lack of affordable places to live? Oregonians, on the whole, say it's mental health and drug addiction. Mm-hmm. And I'm not here to say that that's true or correct or the right sort of way to address policy. But I am saying that if politicians and policies can't connect with what people see as the problem and the solutions to it, it will be difficult to move forward. And that can cut different ways. So Republican maybe is more willing to talk about mental illness and drug addiction and the associated sort of sense of chaos in the streets because of that. But Democrats will repel if it's not talked about in a way that feels like it comes from compassion. Whatever that sounds like, whatever that means exactly, but they're sensitive to that, particularly coming from a Republican. But they're also open to the idea, absolutely, that it is mental health and drug addiction. And there's been real frustration among liberal voters in the Portland metro area when they hear politicians not recognize that that's where their concern is.
Yeah, no, I think we're kind of speaking the same thing. It's just how do we connect those dots from a Republican perspective? And the Democrats, I don't think, are connecting the dots either, by the way. I think that both parties really aren't coming up with a solution. Like, I don't really have a solution for it. I mean, but our solution has normally been, well, my solution is bus tickets, but everybody thinks that's not compassionate enough. Send them to California. Weather's better. Here's your bus ticket. But apparently that's not good enough. And I don't think I would win with that sort of, hard line approach. I think there does need to be, but you have to outline the step-by-step way to get somebody out of addiction, homelessness kind of crisis, and housing fits in that platform, but it's not first. I think that's kind of what we're getting at.
Since it looks like we're going to have a special session and laid off. You talk a little bit about transportation.
Yeah, because I didn't see that on your list, like anywhere.
No, unfortunately. So it's on the when we ask people what's the most important issue, a couple things like transportation rarely shows up at all.
Yeah.
When we ask people directly, how concerned are you about transportation? It'll show up some, but nothing to the intensity of like homelessness or housing affordability or crime, that sort of stuff. When we ask people just to rate the quality of Oregon's roads, about 2/3 of Oregonians say that Oregon's roads are in good shape.
Yeah.
I'm not in the building, sort of the capital politics aren't my expertise at all, but just from a just pure public opinion sort of perspective, I imagine it's pretty difficult to ask Oregonians to raise their taxes a significant amount when by and large, they're pretty happy with Oregon's roads. Now, there's differences. You look at individual communities. Some communities are less happy about the roads than others. Reagan, Albany, we've been doing a lot of work in Albany. I know that the challenge is with Albany streets. So I know that local conditions can be different.
I have a lot of opinions on that, which I will mostly keep to myself. However, I will just say this to the city councilors who are looking at the research, which is in a packet that went to the city council. If you're starting at 50%, you're losing. Okay. So you've got to figure out a way to get to better roads that doesn't start with 50%. Yes, because you need 50% plus one to pass. And I don't think they start in the place they want to start if they're looking at doing. And the only thing that in the presentation that was viable at that moment was a local gas tax. And I think right now is basically the exact wrong time to try to do that. From a timing and a planning perspective. I know that's not your role, John. They asked you to provide that data. I'm just saying, as a strategist, if I'm going to go in and they're going to hire me to pass a gas tax, which they're not going to do because I'm going to work for the opposition campaign. But if they go, and I'm like, okay, so you're telling me that you want to pass a local gas tax, and right this minute the state is debating raising the state gas tax. I'm going to laugh you out of the room. I'm going to say, go find somebody else because I'm not doing it.
Let's set aside the specific campaign politics in Albany. The other thing that's like the broad picture. Transportation is not a priority issue for Oregonians right now. They generally think that Oregon's roads are in relatively good shape. And also, like we've done this for a long time, we've asked about every single mechanism that's been discussed many times over the years, including recently, things that aren't popular. A gas tax, raising registration fees, a vehicle miles travel tax, higher taxes. Every single one of these is unpopular. The only thing that I've been able to test that is like popular is increasing registration fees for new electric vehicles. Yeah. It's like that tax on somebody who ain't me. And look, I am a believer that this is just me speaking as a resident of Oregon, like that our long-term transportation funding has to be different than it is today. And in order to get to someplace different, it's going to require a lot of unpopular decisions. There's not going to be a popular, politically popular way to get from here to there. Someone's going to have to do something unpopular. But because it's like eventually people are going to start saying Oregon roads suck. And what's also potholes and roads that aren't plowed, that's going to be unpopular too. Eventually, yes, I think. And so the theory is like if their theory, I would say Democrats' theory is like keep it at 2/3. So invest a little bit now keeps Oregonians believing their roads are in good shape. For the most part, right? With the maintenance, with the filling the potholes, all that stuff, barring, of course, the Albanys of the world and Oregon City, right? And a few of those other, Wilsonville probably hates traffic. When you got a freeway through the middle of your city, it makes life pretty difficult. Albany, Oregon City, any of those cities where you have those, I think that's probably where they don't really like traffic. Like it's not a problem in Prineville, I'll tell you that. Like we do have traffic concerns. A lot of people don't like waiting and coming down the grade into Prineville, and Bend kind of sucks in the summer, but
nobody's like freaking out over it. They're freaking out over homelessness and the cost of living, the cost of housing, and a $900,000 average median price for a home in Bend. That's what they're freaking out about, right? So
I do it so partly because we worked on it, and it's whenever I drive into Bend, just to call it out, like one of the things that really sort of makes me happy is to see the infrastructure that they've completed as you head into Bend from the north. And it's part of a big bond measure that we had worked on. And I'm not in Bend day to day, and I'm not paying attention to the transportation issues in Bend day to day. But you know what? They raised money. They said they're going to do a specific thing, and they accomplished it and made things better. And there's something real basic about doing that. One of the another challenges with just the transportation package, so far as I understand it, there weren't very many things that you couldn't buy people off with. It was about filling potholes and plowing roads. It wasn't about big pieces of infrastructure that are going to be built that people were going to be able to say, man, we invested in this and we got this thing. It's harder. I imagine, I'm not in the building like you guys are, but I imagine it's harder to do that sort of trade-offs in politicking when you don't have the big projects to trade.
Yeah, and I think that's why this transportation package was never really a priority in the legislature. So it never really came forward and moved forward in a high speed of rate until the end of the session. There never really, because there wasn't really like when housing, remember, was like we had to do something about housing in 23, and that was so they did it and they had it out the door in March of 23. They had a housing package out the door with money and all the things. So it wasn't really there, and so now all of a sudden this was the byproduct of, I think, just poor planning, from leadership and from the governor's office on making sure there was enough in the regular budget, the governor's recommended budget, and in the budget the legislature passed to provide continuing service, because there wasn't an appetite for more. And I think that's why, and even now with what's going to come out of the special session is going to be just a continuing service, gas tax basically is what they're going to pass. So it's not going to be anything more than that. There's no appetite for somebody to think big. But I do think now if somebody were to take transportation and make it a big thing with big ideas, and Reagan and I have talked about this on the podcast before, but transportation is one of the things that if we have to spend money on infrastructure, Republicans would rather spend it on roads than spend it on homelessness, and rather spend it on shelter funding, and rather spend it on, DEI and healthcare for illegals and all the things, right? So I think you can pull people to your side by saying we need more capacity, not better roads. We need more roads. And I think there's some opportunity there. I just haven't really tested it at all.
Well, when we do pull on it, the top priorities for Oregonians when it comes to transportation is repairing our existing roads and highways. Okay, that makes sense. And then number 2 is going to be reducing congestion, which doesn't exactly say how you're going to do it. But when we do surveys and the best ways to reduce congestion, people will say add capacity. Now, again, there are transportation planners out there. People have different visions of what they want the world to look like. And so I'm a pollster, I can't say what's right or wrong in that regard. But if you just ask Oregonians, they think adding capacity, adding lanes is an effective way to reduce congestion, and reducing congestion is one of their top concerns along with maintaining the roads. Yeah. Much higher than transit.
Was that congestion pricing like with tolling in New York? It's been successful, right? Like
it seems to be. People seem to be pretty positive about it. I mean, tolling here is deeply unpopular.
Yeah. Yes, that's for sure. But that the congestion pricing comes after the tolling. Yeah. So I don't know if we'll ever get there, because it still is. I hope it remains deeply, partisan, not even partisan, it's bipartisan. So
it's a bipartisan dislike of tolling. Now, I'm sure tolling was unpopular in every place that they ever implemented it. I don't think there's probably anywhere where the citizens were picketing to put tolls on the roads. Like, I just don't think that ever happens. But I also think that there are places where people like that the tolling systems they have to manage congestion, and only way to get from here to there again is to do something unpopular. And maybe that's not wise for Oregon, but a lot of these things we're not going to find the thing that people really want. It's going to be elected officials taking some leadership about doing some things that people don't realize that are going to be beneficial in the long term.
Hey, I have one last question, and I think Reagan's got one last little topic, and then we'll let you go. But you brought up that everybody's fine with basically charging electric vehicle drivers more.
Yeah. So the specific thing is, high registration fees for new electric vehicles.
Yeah.
But
do you ever in your crosstabs, like ask people if they drive an electric vehicle, their opinion of electric? Like, do we like look at them as like we do a college degree or a high school diploma? Or is there enough in the market to start to bifurcate them at all?
we haven't. I'll tell you that we have, and we have done it mostly in transportation related work that we've done. And I just can't recall what the numbers really suggest. It probably will be something that we'll want to look at in the future. I mean, right now it's not going to be perfect alignment with partisanship, but there's going to be, I would suspect, a fairly strong alignment with partisanship, which is interesting in its own right. But as
changing,
as the numbers go up, how that might respond to how they think about transportation funding generally might change.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious how could it become a predictor, but I don't know, like with Elon, aligning with the Republican Party. I mean, that's maybe backlashed a little bit, and then the Democrat backlash to Elon aligning with us. I just wonder how, in general, electric vehicle drivers, I don't know, maybe someday we'll be able to, as there's more of them, we can get an idea. Do they fit in? Do they align themselves more with D's versus R's? I would assume, but is it dramatically different or dramatically less, I guess?
Right. My guess is, this is a guess. My guess is today we would see a strong alignment with Democrat and Republican and all the things that associated with that. And that'll weaken year after year after year as electric vehicles become a bigger part of the automotive segment. But
potential future predictor.
Yeah.
One of the other things that is relevant here in your January insights is, and I think that this is just something to put out there, the Oregon Department of Transportation, you asked if you did a couple of different agencies, and Intel was in there. And so Intel is 55% positive, 19% negative, like you would do for an elected official or somebody running for office. And then Oregon Department of Transportation, 60% positive, 28% negative. That's compared to OHSU, which was the most positive, 77% to 13% negative. DLCD comes in last, still 46% positive, 21% total negative. But you just add another person to that number anytime they want to do anything with their land that's not allowed. But it's interesting to see where the Department of Transportation is. And so kind of one of the things that the Republicans have to decide is, are they going to go at the governor and blame the governor for the failures they're supposed, and sort of they're driving this message of failure management? Are they going to try to pin that on the governor? Are they going to try to pin that on legislative Democrats? Are they going to try to pin it on ODOT themselves? There's been sort of an attempt, at least in my view of the messaging, to do sort of some of all three. It'll be interesting to see if you guys eventually ask a follow-up or do more polling on transportation that becomes public, if that changes the view on ODOT, and if it changes it with all Oregonians or just Republicans, which I think would be interesting. We don't have an answer for that yet. Just something to monitor. So last thing I wanted to talk about was something that I found right before we started the podcast, but the National Republican Senatorial Committee put out a memo to some of their it's to interested parties, but it's distributed to a lot of people. And in that memo, they called out a new feature coming to iPhones this fall. And the reason that I was somewhat familiar with this is I installed the iOS beta on my phone like a week ago when it went from being developer beta to the public beta, because I like to know what's coming, and this version of iOS has a brand new design, which is really, really interesting to me. So one of these features it's not technically a new feature, but they redesigned it to be much more effective. And so now, and I'm showing this, we don't have video on the podcast, but there's categories in your messages in the top right to filter them. So it's messages, and that's like all the contacts that you text in kind of the order of who you most recently texted. There's a category now that most people aren't currently using that I think more people will use because Apple's going to put up like a little splash page telling people you can use it, where you can filter unknown senders, which is somebody who's not in your contacts that has sent you a text message. And this impacts you potentially, or at least the folks you use to do your polling, John. This impacts the political fundraising, because up until now, the carriers have cracked down on it a little bit. But generally, if you go through all of the setup processes properly, that's harder to say, you get the same status as anybody else. If you send a text message to somebody, it shows up in their inbox and it's sorted by most recent. So if you just sent it, it's unread and it's in the top. Very similar to how if you send a piece of political mail, it sits right there, right next to the letter that you got from your friend. Apple's significantly changing this, where they have now this categorization feature. And right now it is not on by default. That could change at any time, where people you don't know that text you now are put in a separate category. It does put a little badge up there, so it turns blue when you get a text from unknown, but it doesn't deliver a notification and it doesn't leave it in your main list. And so obviously a lot of political groups are freaking out about this. I'm imagining that's going to impact polling as well. I didn't know, John, if this is something you're following. I don't know if you have anything to say about it, but I found it super interesting. I always love to see this difference when politics interacts with technology, because I find that fascinating.
Well, the polling industry certainly experienced it with, through the just real quickly evolution, right? It was all landlines, and then cell phones came along. Cell phones were great because people would have in their pocket, but people were paying per minute, and they didn't like, for inbound calls to have to pay for a stranger call them. Then caller ID came along, and all these things. Technology in some ways helped pollsters, because when people had cell phones, they were available when they weren't at home. It hurt pollsters because caller ID allowed people to screen their phone calls more effectively. Texting is certainly something that we do a lot. And pollsters, they have the different tricks and tools, and people use them, deploy them differently. But we, almost every survey we do now incorporates text messaging as part of what we do. And so to the extent that people are going to be maybe more able to filter, I think my first instinct is less about overall response rates, but that those who filter in or filter out are not going to be the same populations, and that I might be able to get the numbers that I need, 400, 500, 1,000, whatever it is. Yeah. And I might even be able to get the right number of Democrats and Republicans by party registration, but there might be something, again, different about those who are actively looking for polls, political polls, and those who are actively trying to avoid them. And they may be different in important ways that we'll have to manage. Now, there's other ways to reach people. We still do live interview phone calls. We're better and better able to reach people by email. There's ways there's panels that are maintained. There's lots of things. We could talk a whole methodology stuff, but it as a pollster, I get anxious if people are better able to ignore my phone calls, my outreach.
Well, and I think what it sort of sparked for me, because I hadn't thought about it in the terms until I talked about it just now, political mail is considered and is delivered either equivalently to your regular mail, or sometimes it's prioritized. Actually, it gets the political mail tag, and so theoretically they're delivering it because there's like First Amendment implications, right? If the Postal Service doesn't deliver it. And so as long as you tag it correctly, it gets delivered. Same thing with the carriers. As long as you're not mass spamming, you're utilizing your First Amendment right to contact people, you give them a way to opt out, then they actually prioritize those text messages here. And so this is kind of one of those things where it's like, is there any kind of constitutional implication or free speech implication or anything? And that I don't know. I mean, that would require attorneys to weigh in. For Apple essentially deprioritizing certain kinds of communications. And there hasn't necessarily been a way to do that before. I mean, maybe caller ID where you could sort of screen, but the call still rang through, you could just decide not to answer it, right? Same thing. The text comes in, you just decide not to answer it. And so I think that that's going to be super interesting to see, because now if the NRSC is all hot and bothered about this, which they are, they at the bottom of this, they said, hey, we have very little time to change this because it's almost August and Apple's going to release this software in September. So if they start making this Apple software update a political thing, what's going to happen with that? And I'm going to be fascinated to see, what do Democrats do? Do they go, okay, we're going to stick with the Republicans on this because it hurts us? Or are they going to go, well, no, Apple is a company and they have freedom? I think that's going to be super interesting as well to see how that plays out. And if it impacts what they do at the end, does Apple change this feature? Do they distinguish between business spam and political spam? Or like what choices do they make?
I mean, Apple's not interested in looking out for pollsters, but I wish for my industry, and I think that what we provide is valuable. So for the interest of the world, is that like that there was some sort of whitelist that would be possible to get on if you followed all the rules, if you were doing contacts for particular purposes. So say it's for government. So we do politics a lot. A lot of my work is just like to help the city of Albany figure out how to meet the priorities of the people in the community with regards to transportation, right? I mean, people can disagree ultimately about the outcomes. They're the politics that flow from that. But a lot of, the work that we're trying to do is just like help a community figure out how to, budget appropriately in alignment with the community's values. And I hope that the technology doesn't get in the way of that sort of work.
Isn't it? I find what's interesting about this is going back. I think that there's the human mindset, American mindset, maybe more so than, I don't know how people in Russia or China feel about their cell phones, but there's some weird intrinsic sense that when I had my home phone and I was listed in the white papers, you could look up anybody's number and call, and people didn't get upset that you got a hold of them. But the amount of people that get upset, the visceralness of calling their cell phone or texting their cell phone, I think is driving this tech from Apple's perspective. And the reason why also, right, the NRCC and all these other groups, including myself, I mean, we use texting because it works. It's effective. Like, you have some negatives, but the positives of whatever you're trying to do outweigh the negative blowback of it. And I think the consumer is clearly, they have this weird sense that if you text me on my cell phone, it's intrusive. Mm-hmm. But they don't have that really when you send them emails. Like they've gotten over that. I don't know if that's just the time and space.
Brian, you need to read your responses from like newsletters. I still get people who are like, "Don't email me. How dare you email?" I see them all the time. Oh, I still see them all the time. People get mad about it.
But the responses when you text, I mean, the that you get from people are just so insane. Like, and you're like,
it's low effort. It's low effort. If I have to hit reply and then I got to compose the email where I call you, a bald loser, and then I got to send it. It's way easier to text you.
But there is some, I guess that was my point. Just the whole idea that our cell phones, somehow people are very just, this is my space. And it's like part of their bubble. It's almost like standing too close of them on a TriMet. You're in my bubble. Right. And they don't like it when people text them that they don't know. People don't like that. How'd you get this number? Mm-hmm. Probably the number one response. How'd you get this number? Well, good enough. I think we can probably end it there, John. I think dhmresearch.com/insights. Yep. Go there. It should be on your weekly, not your daily, but your weekly blog checking to see what's going on. You guys put enough content on there that I think it's
we'll have some stuff coming out shortly on transportation, around education, and around the Oregon Health Plan. So all relevant topics to what's happening in Oregon nowadays.
That's great.
I would love to see the Oregon Health Plan stuff too. That's we don't have time to get into it, but that's fascinating stuff.
I didn't get a survey on that one. I didn't get no text message.
Well, you got to check your unknown senders, Brian. You got to look and see if John's in your unknown senders, because it's not John, it's going to be somebody else reaching out.
True.
John doesn't have to get back on the phones today and try to find 5 more people to finish his poll.
If OHA has a bad negative connotation, they'll just change the name again. That's what we'll learn. So when in doubt.
OHA does okay. OHA does.
Thanks, John. Appreciate your time.
We're going to talk about it as well too. We'll talk about that next time.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.